The information I'm about to share with you in this video is so incredible, so mind-blowing, that it's going to completely change the way you think about human history and our ancient past. Because what we've been taught in school, what we've been told by mainstream archaeologists and historians, well, let me tell you, there's a whole lot more to the story, and the evidence is literally buried right beneath our feet, hidden under millions of tons of sand, scattered across some of the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth. And here's the thing, when I say hidden, I don't just mean lost to time, I mean deliberately obscured information that's been suppressed, evidence that's been ignored, and discoveries that have been dismissed or explained away because they don't fit the comfortable narrative that we've all been fed since childhood. But the truth is starting to emerge, and what we're finding is absolutely staggering now. Before we dive deep into this, let me set the stage here because we need to understand the sheer scale of what we're talking about. The world's deserts cover approximately 1/5 of the Earth's land surface. That's millions upon millions of square miles of territory. And when you really stop and think about it, these vast expanses of sand and rock weren't always the barren wastelands that we see today. In fact, the geological and archaeological evidence tells us a completely different story, a story of lush environments, thriving ecosystems, and yes, advanced human civilizations that flourished in places that are now completely inhospitable to human life. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, what happened to these civilizations? Where did they go? And more importantly, what evidence of their existence still remains buried beneath the sand waiting to be discovered? Let's start with something that should absolutely blow your mind. The Sahara Desert, which, as I'm sure you know, is the largest hot desert in the world, spanning over 3.5 million square miles across North Africa. Well, this massive desert, this seemingly endless ocean of sand that we think of as one of the most hostile environments on the planet. It turns out that just a few thousand years ago, the Sahara was actually a green paradise. I'm talking rivers, lakes, vegetation, wildlife, and thriving human populations living across an area that's now completely barren. And when I say a few thousand years ago, I'm not talking about millions of years in the distant past. I'm talking about a time period that overlaps with recorded human history. We're talking about a transformation that occurred within the last 10,000 years. And in some cases, scientists believe this dramatic climate shift happened in as little as 100 to 500 years. Just think about that for a second. An entire region larger than the continental United States transformed from a lush green environment into the world's largest desert in potentially just a few centuries. Now, the mainstream explanation for this is typically attributed to changes in Earth's orbital tilt affecting the African monsoon system. And sure, that's part of the story. But here's where things get really interesting, because when we start to look at the evidence of what existed in the Sahara before it became a desert, when we start to examine the archaeological discoveries that are now being made thanks to modern technology, like ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, we're finding something that doesn't quite fit the official narrative. We're finding evidence of sophisticated civilizations, evidence of advanced knowledge, evidence of structures and settlements that, according to our current timeline of human history, shouldn't exist. Let me give you some specifics here. In recent years, archaeologists using satellite technology have discovered literally hundreds of previously unknown ancient sites scattered throughout the Sahara Desert. We're talking about stone structures, fortifications, settlements, and even evidence of sophisticated irrigation systems in places where conventional wisdom told us that nobody ever lived. I mean, think about the implications of this for a second. We've got teams of researchers discovering castle-like fortresses in the middle of the Libyan desert with walls that are 13 feet high. These are substantial structures built by people who clearly had advanced construction knowledge and organizational capabilities. And the question nobody seems to want to answer is, who built these structures? When exactly were they built? And what level of civilization did these people have? And here's where it gets even more fascinating, because these discoveries aren't isolated incidents. They're being found across the entire Sahara region, from Libya to Algeria, from Mauritania to Chad. We're talking about evidence of human civilization spread across millions of square miles of what is now barren desert. And what's really interesting is that many of these sites are just now being discovered, despite the fact that archaeologists have been studying this region for decades. Why? Because they're buried, they're hidden beneath layers of sand that have accumulated over thousands of years. And it's only now, with modern technology, that we're able to see beneath the surface and discover what's really there. Now let's talk about something that I find absolutely crucial to understanding this mystery, and that's the timeline. Because when you start to piece together the evidence from multiple different scientific disciplines, when you look at the geological data, the archaeological findings, the climate studies, the evidence of ancient rivers and lakes that once existed in the Sahara, something very interesting emerges. And that's the fact that all of this evidence points to a massive climate catastrophe that occurred somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. Now, depending on which studies you look at, the exact dates vary. Some scientists say 5,000 years ago, others say 6,000, some even suggest as far back as 11,000 years ago. But here's what's really interesting about these dates. They correspond almost exactly with the timeline of other major catastrophic events that we know occurred in human history. For example, let's talk about the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe. This was a period roughly 11,000 to 13,000 years ago, where global temperatures plummeted dramatically, where massive changes in climate occurred across the planet, and where, according to geological evidence, something absolutely catastrophic happened to alter the Earth's environment. And here's the thing. This timeline matches up almost perfectly with the estimates of when the Sahara began its transformation from green paradise to desert. It also coincides with a whole bunch of other mysterious events in human history. The disappearance of megafauna, the supposed end of the last ice age, and if you believe the ancient legends, the destruction of advanced civilizations like Atlantis. I mean, really think about this for a second. We have multiple lines of evidence, all pointing to the same general time period when something massive, something world-changing occurred on this planet. And speaking of Atlantis, I know some of you are probably rolling your eyes right now thinking, oh, here we go, another crazy Atlantis theory. But hold on a second, because there's actually some really compelling evidence that we need to talk about now. I've discussed this in previous videos, but it bears repeating. There's a geological formation in Mauritania in the Western Sahara called the Richat Structure, or the Eye of the Sahara. And this structure is absolutely fascinating, because when you look at it from satellite imagery, it matches almost perfectly the description that Plato gave of Atlantis. In his dialogues, we're talking about concentric circles. We're talking about the right dimensions. We're talking about a location that Plato specifically described as being beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which would place it on the Atlantic coast of Africa, exactly where the Richat Structure is located. Now, the mainstream explanation for the Richat Structure is that it's a natural geological formation created by erosion. But here's what they don't tell you. Recent studies have confirmed that the ocean once flowed through this exact region. What they're calling the Trans-Saharan Seaway actually carved its way right through the heart of North Africa. And when you go to the Richat Structure today, what do you find? Massive salt deposits at surface level, salt deposits that could only have come from ocean water. And not only that, but the entire structure is eroded down to bedrock, exactly what you would expect if massive tidal forces had blasted right through it now. Is this proof that the Richat Structure is Atlantis? No, of course not. But it's certainly compelling evidence that we can't just dismiss, and it raises serious questions about what really happened in this region thousands of years ago. But let's move beyond Atlantis for a moment, because whether or not you believe in that particular legend, the broader point remains the same. And that is, that there is overwhelming evidence of advanced human civilization in regions that we've been told were uninhabitable, or at the very least sparsely populated by primitive peoples. And nowhere is this more apparent than when we look at the relationship between the ancient Sahara and ancient Egypt. Because here's something that should really make you stop and think. Egypt is located within the Sahara Desert. The Nile River, which is the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization, runs right through it. And when we look at the timeline of ancient Egyptian civilization, it coincides almost perfectly with the timeline of when the Sahara was green. Now, conventional Egyptology tells us that Egyptian civilization began around 5,000 years ago with the first dynasty, and that the pyramids were built shortly after that time frame. But here's where things get problematic, because there's evidence, lots of evidence, that suggests the timeline we've been taught is completely wrong. Let's start with the Great Sphinx of Giza, one of the most iconic monuments in all of Egypt now. According to mainstream archaeologists, the Sphinx is about 4,500 years old. It was supposedly built during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre in the 4th dynasty, but there's a big problem with this theory, and that problem is water erosion. You see, the Sphinx and its surrounding enclosure show massive amounts of water erosion, deep vertical weathering patterns that could only have been caused by heavy sustained rainfall. But here's the kicker. The last time the Nile Delta region experienced that kind of heavy rainfall was more than 7,000 years ago, during the time when the Sahara was still green. This means that the Sphinx has to be at least 7,000 years old, possibly much older, which would make it more than twice as old as the official timeline suggests. And this isn't just some fringe theory we're talking about. Geologists have examined the Sphinx, geologists who specialize in weathering patterns and erosion. And their conclusion is clear. The weathering on the Sphinx is not consistent with wind erosion, which is what you would expect in a desert environment. It's consistent with water erosion, heavy rainfall over long periods of time. So we have scientific evidence, geological evidence, that directly contradicts the official timeline of when the Sphinx was built. And yet mainstream Egyptology continues to dismiss this evidence, continues to cling to the traditional dating, despite the fact that it doesn't match the physical evidence. And you have to ask yourself why. Why is there such resistance to revising the timeline? Why is there such reluctance to admit that maybe our understanding of ancient Egyptian history is incomplete or even wrong? And the Sphinx is just one example. Let's talk about the pyramids themselves, because there are some really interesting questions that nobody seems to want to address. For instance, not a single hieroglyph, not one has ever been found, that depicts the construction of the pyramids. There are no ancient Egyptian texts that describe how the pyramids were built, no detailed plans, no construction records, nothing. And this is really strange when you think about it, because the ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They documented everything they left behind, thousands upon thousands of hieroglyphic texts describing their daily lives, their religious beliefs, their military campaigns, their building projects. And yet, when it comes to the most impressive structures they supposedly ever built, the pyramids, there's complete silence. Why is that? Some researchers have suggested, and I think there's merit to this idea, that perhaps the pyramids weren't actually built by the dynastic Egyptians at all. Perhaps they were inherited from an earlier, much older civilization that existed before the Sahara turned into a desert, and that the dynastic Egyptians simply found these structures and claimed them as their own. I mean, think about it. When you look at the condition that many Egyptian monuments were in when they were first rediscovered by modern explorers, they were completely buried in sand. They had been buried for thousands of years. It's almost as if there was a massive gap in time between when these structures were built and when the civilization we know as ancient Egypt came into existence. And this would explain a lot of the mysteries and inconsistencies that we see in Egyptian archaeology. It would explain why the earliest pyramids, the ones that are supposedly the first attempts at pyramid building, are actually the most sophisticated and the most precisely constructed, while later pyramids are cruder and less advanced. that's backwards from what you would expect if you were watching a civilization develop and refine its building techniques over time. Now let's expand our view a bit and talk about the broader region. Because the Sahara Desert isn't just about Egypt. There's evidence of lost civilizations throughout North Africa. And when you start to examine the archaeological record, you find something really interesting. There are ancient ruins scattered all across the Sahara from one end to the other, and many of these ruins date back to the same general time period when the Sahara was green. We're talking about settlements in Algeria, ruins in Chadstone, structures in Sudan, and mysterious formations in Mauritania. And what's fascinating is that many of these sites show evidence of sophisticated planning, of astronomical alignments, of advanced architectural knowledge that supposedly shouldn't exist according to our current understanding of human development. At that time, take Sudan, for example. Most people have no idea that there are actually more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. I'm not kidding. Sudan has over 200 pyramids compared to Egypt's 80 or so. And these aren't small structures either. Some of them are massive, and they show clear architectural similarities to the Egyptian pyramids, suggesting a cultural connection between these regions. But here's the thing, Sudan borders Egypt directly to the south. It's literally right next door. And yet we're told that these two regions developed independently, that there wasn't significant contact or cultural exchange between them. Does that really make sense? Especially when you consider that during the time when the Sahara was green, this entire region would have been connected by rivers and lakes that would have facilitated trade and cultural exchange. And then we have the whole question of the ancient river systems that once flowed through the Sahara. Because this is really important to understanding the bigger picture here. In 2015, scientists discovered evidence of a massive network of ancient rivers that once crisscrossed the Sahara Desert. We're talking about river systems that would have been comparable in size to the Nile. And these rivers weren't just small streams, they were major waterways that would have supported large populations and facilitated the movement of people and goods across the region. And here's what's really interesting. These ancient river systems date back to approximately 5,000 years ago, the exact same time period that we're talking about, when the Sahara transformed from green to desert. Now, there's an ancient map that I find absolutely fascinating in this context, and that's the map based on Herodotus's descriptions from around 450 BC. Herodotus, who's often called the father of history, wrote about a Nile river that ran from west to east, right through the Sahara, before curving north toward the Mediterranean. Now, for the longest time, historians dismissed this as simply a mistake on Herodotus's part. They assumed he got his information wrong, or that he was repeating legends and myths that had no basis in reality. But guess what? When scientists discovered those ancient river systems in 2015, when they mapped out where these rivers once flowed, they found that the pattern matches almost exactly what Herodotus described. The rivers originated in the Western Sahara, in the region of modern-day Mauritania, and flowed eastward before connecting with other river systems that eventually led to the Nile Delta. So it turns out that Herodotus wasn't wrong at all. He was accurately describing a geographical reality that existed thousands of years before his time, a reality that had been forgotten and buried beneath the sand. And this raises a really important question. If Herodotus had access to accurate information about river systems that existed thousands of years before his time, where did that information come from? How did he know about these ancient rivers? The only logical explanation is that there must have been some kind of oral tradition, some kind of historical record that was passed down through generations, preserving knowledge of what the Sahara looked like before it became a desert. And if that's the case, if there were people preserving this kind of geographical knowledge for thousands of years, then what else did they know? What other information about ancient civilizations, about advanced technologies, about historical events, has been preserved in oral traditions and ancient texts that we've dismissed as mythology? Now let's talk about some of the specific discoveries that have been made in recent years, because this is where things get really interesting thanks to modern technology, particularly satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar. Archaeologists have been able to see beneath the sand and discover structures and sites that were previously completely unknown. And what they're finding is remarkable. In Libya, for example, researchers discovered what they're calling castle-like fortresses in the middle of the desert. These are substantial structures with walls that are 4 meters high, that's over 13 feet, and they include sophisticated irrigation systems, the kind of infrastructure that indicates a settled agricultural society. But according to our conventional understanding of history, nobody was supposed to be living in these regions. They were supposed to be empty desert, uninhabited. And yet here we have clear evidence of not just human habitation, but organized communities with advanced construction capabilities. And this isn't an isolated discovery. Similar structures have been found throughout the Sahara, in Algeria, in Chad, in Niger, in Mauritania. We're talking about hundreds of sites, maybe even thousands, that are still waiting to be excavated and studied. And here's what really gets me. Many of these structures are at surface level. They're not even buried very deep, which means they're relatively recent in geological terms. And yet we knew nothing about them until just a few years ago. How is that possible? How can we have massive stone structures scattered across millions of square miles of territory that we knew absolutely nothing about until satellites happened to image them from space? It suggests that our archaeological understanding of this region is woefully incomplete, that we've barely scratched the surface, literally, of what's actually there. And here's something else to consider. If these surface-level structures that we're just now discovering date back several thousand years to the time when the Sahara was green, what about structures that are buried deeper? What about sites that are under 10 feet of sand, 20 feet, 50 feet of sand accumulation? Because remember, in some parts of the Sahara, sand dunes can be over 100 feet deep. That means there could be entire cities, entire civilizations buried beneath the sand, completely invisible to us, even with modern technology. And we would have no idea they're even there unless we happen to dig in exactly the right spot. This brings me to another really important point about the Sahara, and that's the fact that despite its massive size, despite its historical and archaeological significance, the Sahara is actually one of the least studied regions on Earth from an archaeological perspective. Think about that. We've got millions of square miles of territory that we know was once inhabited by human civilizations, and we've barely even begun to explore it. Systematically, most of the Sahara has never been surveyed by archaeologists, most of it has never been excavated, and until recently, most of it couldn't even be properly studied because of how remote and inhospitable it is. But that's changing now with satellite technology, with drones, with advanced imaging techniques. We're finally able to see what's really there. And what we're finding is that the Sahara is an archaeological goldmine. We're talking about the potential for discoveries that could completely revolutionize our understanding of human history. But here's where I need to address something that I think is really important, and that's the question of why so much of this information seems to be ignored or downplayed by mainstream academia. Because when you start to look at the evidence, when you start to piece together all of these discoveries, all of these anomalies, all of these inconsistencies in the official timeline, it becomes pretty clear that there's something that doesn't quite add up. And yet when researchers try to publish papers about this, when they try to present alternative theories or interpretations, they're often met with skepticism or outright dismissal from the academic establishment. And you have to wonder why is there such resistance to new evidence? Why is there such reluctance to revise our understanding of history in light of new discoveries? Now, I'm not saying there's some grand conspiracy to hide the truth about ancient civilizations. I don't think it's quite that simple. But what I do think is that there's a deeply entrenched academic paradigm, a framework for understanding human history that's been built up over centuries. And when evidence emerges that challenges that paradigm, there's a natural institutional resistance to accepting it. Because accepting it would mean admitting that we got things wrong, that our textbooks are incomplete, that the timeline we've been teaching for generations needs to be revised. And for many academics, that's a very uncomfortable position to be in. Their entire careers are built on a certain understanding of history. And when that understanding is challenged, it can feel threatening. But the truth is, science advances by challenging established ideas, by questioning assumptions, by following the evidence wherever it leads. And right now, the evidence is telling us that the story of human civilization is far more complex, far more ancient, and far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. The evidence is telling us that thousands of years ago, there were advanced civilizations living in regions that are now barren desert civilizations that had sophisticated knowledge of engineering, of astronomy, of agriculture, of architecture. And these civilizations left behind evidence of their existence, evidence that's now buried beneath millions of tons of sand waiting to be discovered. Let's talk about some of the specifics of what made the ancient Sahara such a paradise, because this is really important to understanding the full picture here. When scientists say that the Sahara was green, they're not just talking about a bit more vegetation than exists today. They're talking about a fundamentally different environment. We're talking about a region that had rainfall that was 10 times higher than it is today. We're talking about massive lakes that covered hundreds of thousands of square miles. We're talking about river systems that rivaled the great rivers of the world. And we're talking about ecosystems that supported enormous biodiversity, including large populations of animals and humans. Take Lake Chad, for example, at its peak during the Green Sahara period. Ancient Lake Chad covered approximately 140,000 square miles. That's more than 360,000 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's larger than all of the North American Great Lakes. Combined, let me repeat, that the Sahara once contained a lake that was bigger than all of the Great Lakes put together. And it wasn't the only massive lake in the region. There were dozens of major lakes scattered throughout the Sahara, some of them covering tens of thousands of square miles. And all of these lakes supported complex ecosystems, fish, birds, vegetation, and of course human settlements along their shores. And here's what's really mind-blowing about this. We only discovered most of these ancient lakes in the last 10 to 20 years. In 2010, researchers identified a massive lake that nobody even knew existed until satellite analysis revealed its ancient shorelines. This lake at its highest level covered more than 42,000 square miles. And when you look at satellite imagery of the region today, you would never know it was there. It's completely invisible. The entire area is now barren desert with no indication that it was once covered by water, except for the faint traces that can only be seen from space. This just goes to show how effectively the desert has hidden evidence of its past, how thoroughly the landscape has been transformed. Now, when you combine the evidence of these ancient lakes with the evidence of the ancient river systems, what you get is a picture of a region that was absolutely ideal for human civilization. You've got abundant fresh water, you've got fertile land for agriculture, you've got fish and wildlife for food, you've got rivers that facilitate trade and transportation, and you've got a climate that's actually pleasant to live in. Unlike the brutal heat of the modern Sahara, this was a paradise. And it makes perfect sense that humans would have settled there in large numbers, would have built cities, and developed sophisticated cultures in this environment. And here's something else that's really important to understand about the timeline here when we talk about the Sahara being green 5,000 years ago, that places it squarely in the middle of what archaeologists call the Neolithic period. This is the time when agriculture was developing, when humans were transitioning from hunter-gatherer societies to settled agricultural communities, when the first cities were being built in places like Mesopotamia, and when writing was being invented. In other words, this wasn't some prehistoric time before human civilization. This was right in the middle of the development of civilization as we know it. So the idea that there were sophisticated societies living in the Sahara at this time isn't far-fetched at all. In fact, it would be strange if there weren't. But here's what's really interesting when you compare the timeline of the Sahara's transformation from green to desert with the timeline of the rise of ancient Egyptian civilization. You notice something remarkable. Egyptian civilization appears right around the time that the Sahara is turning into a desert. It's almost as if there's a direct connection, as if the people who were living in the Green Sahara were forced to migrate to the only remaining source of water in the region, the Nile River. And that this concentration of population along the Nile is what gave rise to Egyptian civilization. Think about it. If you had millions of people living across North Africa, supported by an extensive network of rivers and lakes, and then, suddenly over the course of just a few centuries, that entire environment collapsed, what would those people do? They would migrate to wherever water still existed, and the Nile River, being fed by sources far to the south in the African highlands, would have been one of the few permanent water sources remaining in the region. So you would have had a massive migration of people all converging on the Nile Valley, bringing with them whatever knowledge and cultural traditions they had developed during the millennia, when the Sahara was green. And this might explain some of the mysteries of ancient Egypt. It might explain why Egyptian civilization seems to appear so suddenly, with so many advanced capabilities already in place. It might explain the sophisticated astronomical knowledge, that the Egyptians possessed the advanced architectural techniques, the complex religious and philosophical systems. These weren't developed from scratch by a primitive society. They were inherited from an earlier culture that had been developing for thousands of years in the Green Sahara. And this brings us to one of the most important questions in all of ancient history. And that's the question of what knowledge has been lost. What did ancient civilizations know that we've forgotten? Because when you really think about it, the evidence suggests that ancient peoples had access to information and capabilities that seem almost impossible, given the technology they supposedly had available to them. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza, for example. This is a structure that contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, some of them weighing over 80 tons, and it's constructed with a level of precision that we would struggle to match even with modern technology. The base of the pyramid is leveled to within fractions of an inch across a 13-acre area. The sides are aligned almost perfectly with true north, south, east, and west, and the mathematical relationships encoded in its dimensions suggest a sophisticated understanding of geometry and even the value of pi. Now, the mainstream explanation is that the Egyptians built this using copper tools, wooden rollers, and lots of manual labor. But when you really examine this explanation, when you look at the practical difficulties involved, it starts to seem implausible. Could you really quarry, transport, and precisely place 2.3 million massive stone blocks using only primitive tools? Could you really achieve that level of precision, that level of alignment, without sophisticated measuring instruments and surveying equipment? And more importantly, why would you? Because building the Great Pyramid, using the methods that are typically proposed, would have required an enormous investment of resources and labor spanning decades, if not centuries. So there must have been a very good reason to build it, but what was it? The standard explanation that it was a tomb for a pharaoh seems inadequate when you consider the scale and sophistication of the structure. And here's something else that's really strange about the Great Pyramid. There are no hieroglyphs inside it, no inscriptions, no decorations, nothing that would indicate who built it, or when, or for what purpose. This is completely unlike every other Egyptian tomb and temple, which are covered in hieroglyphic texts and images. So we have the most impressive structure in all of ancient Egypt, and yet it contains no information about itself, no identification of its builder, no explanation of its purpose. This is really odd, and it's led some researchers to suggest that maybe the Great Pyramid is older than we think. Maybe it predates the dynastic Egyptians entirely. Maybe it was built by that earlier civilization that lived in the Green Sahara, and the dynastic Egyptians inherited it and didn't know who built it or why. Now I know this sounds speculative, and I'm not saying this is definitely what happened, but I am saying that the evidence allows for this possibility, and given all of the other anomalies and mysteries surrounding Egyptian civilization, I think it's a possibility that deserves serious consideration, because the more we learn about the ancient world, the more we discover that our ancestors were far more capable, far more knowledgeable, and far more sophisticated than we've given them credit for. Let's talk about something else that I find absolutely fascinating, and that's the question of what other regions of the world might be hiding evidence of lost civilizations, because the Sahara isn't the only place where dramatic climate changes have occurred. It's not the only place where advanced societies might have been destroyed and buried by natural forces. Think about the Amazon rainforest, for example. Recent discoveries using LiDAR technology have revealed that the Amazon was once home to massive settlements, sophisticated agricultural systems, and complex networks of roads and earthworks that we had no idea existed because they were completely hidden by the jungle canopy. Researchers have found evidence of cities that could have housed tens of thousands of people, cities that were abandoned and consumed by the jungle in just a few centuries. And here's the really interesting thing: many of these discoveries in the Amazon were made in areas that had already been surveyed on foot by archaeologists. Archaeologists who saw nothing, because the jungle had so thoroughly covered any trace of these ancient settlements. They literally walked right past a 7-story pyramid and didn't even know it was there, because it was covered by vegetation. This just goes to show how effectively nature can hide evidence of human civilization, how completely a landscape can be transformed in just a few hundred or a few thousand years. So if this can happen in the Amazon, if massive cities can be hidden beneath the jungle canopy, and if sophisticated civilizations can be buried beneath the sands of the Sahara, then where else might we find evidence of lost civilizations? What about the Congo Basin? What about Central Africa? What about the vast expanses of the Pacific where rising sea levels have submerged coastal regions that were once above water? What about the Persian Gulf, which geological evidence suggests was once a fertile river valley before it was flooded? At the end of the last ice age, the point is that there are vast areas of the world that have never been properly surveyed. Archaeologically vast areas where dramatic environmental changes have occurred, and where evidence of ancient human civilization might be waiting to be discovered. And this brings me back to the central question that I posed at the beginning of this video: what don't they want you to know now? When I say they, I'm not talking about some shadowy cabal of conspirators. I'm talking about the institutional biases, the academic paradigms, the conventional thinking that resists new evidence, that doesn't fit established theories. I'm talking about the tendency to dismiss alternative interpretations, to ignore anomalous data, to cling to comfortable narratives, even when those narratives are contradicted by physical evidence. Because the truth is that the story we've been told about human history, the story of a steady linear progression from primitive hunter-gatherers to advanced civilization, that story is almost certainly too simple. The evidence suggests that human history is far more complex, that there have been rises and falls, that advanced civilizations have emerged and disappeared, that knowledge has been gained and lost, and that the timeline we've been taught is incomplete, and in some cases just plain wrong. And the reason this matters, the reason this is important, is because understanding our true history, understanding where we came from, and what our ancestors were capable of, gives us a better understanding of who we are as a species and what we might be capable of in the future. If ancient civilizations were able to achieve sophisticated feats of engineering and architecture, if they possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, if they developed complex philosophical and spiritual systems, then maybe we need to reassess our assumptions about the development of human civilization. Maybe we need to admit that we don't have all the answers, that there's still a lot We don't know about our past, and that's okay. Not knowing is the beginning of discovery. It's what drives us to keep searching, to keep asking questions, to keep challenging our assumptions. And that's what's so exciting about the discoveries being made in the Sahara and other places around the world. We're living in a time when new technologies are allowing us to see things that were previously invisible, to peer beneath the surface and discover what's really there. And what we're finding is that there's so much more to our history than we ever imagined. There are entire civilizations waiting to be rediscovered, ancient knowledge waiting to be recovered, and mysteries waiting to be solved. So what's buried beneath the sands of the Sahara? What lost civilizations are hiding there waiting to be found? Well, I'll tell you what, I think we've only scratched the surface. Literally. I think the discoveries that have been made so far are just the beginning. I think there are incredible archaeological treasures still waiting to be unearthed, cities that have been buried for thousands of years, temples and monuments that rival anything we've seen in Egypt, artifacts that will challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient history and knowledge that could transform our understanding of human civilization. And here's my prediction. In our lifetimes, we're going to see discoveries made in the Sahara that will be absolutely revolutionary discoveries that will force us to rewrite the history books. Discoveries that will prove once and for all that our ancestors were far more advanced and far more sophisticated than mainstream archaeology has been willing to admit, because the evidence is there. It's literally right beneath our feet, buried under the sand, scattered across millions of square miles of desert, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to tell its story. Now I know some people will watch this video and dismiss everything I've said as speculation or conspiracy theory. And that's fine, everyone's entitled to their opinion. But I would encourage those people to actually look at the evidence, to read the scientific studies, to examine the archaeological discoveries, to look at the satellite imagery, and to ask themselves whether the conventional narrative really explains everything we're seeing. Because I don't think it does. I think there are too many anomalies, too many inconsistencies, too many mysteries that don't fit the official story. And I think the only way we're going to solve those mysteries is by being willing to question our assumptions, by being open to new interpretations, and by following the evidence wherever it leads, even if that means admitting that we got things wrong. So what don't they want you to know? They don't want you to know that human history is far more ancient and far more complex than you've been taught. They don't want you to know that advanced civilizations existed thousands of years before the rise of ancient Egypt or Sumeria or any of the other civilizations we learn about in school. They don't want you to know that these civilizations possessed knowledge and capabilities that seem almost impossible given what we think we know about ancient technology. And they don't want you to know that evidence of these civilizations still exists, buried beneath the sand, hidden beneath the jungle canopy, submerged beneath rising seas waiting to be discovered. But the truth is coming out. The evidence is mounting, the discoveries are being made, and it's becoming harder and harder to deny that there's something important that we've been missing, something crucial that's been left out of our history books, and that something is the story of advanced ancient civilizations that flourished and fell long before recorded history civilizations, that left behind evidence of their existence in the form of mysterious structures, sophisticated artifacts, and ancient knowledge preserved in myths and legends. And here's the really important part. This isn't just about satisfying our curiosity about the past. This is about understanding who we are as a species, understanding our capabilities, understanding what we've achieved before, and what we might be capable of achieving again. Because if our ancestors, thousands of years ago, living in a world without modern technology, were able to create structures, like the Great Pyramid, were able to develop sophisticated systems of mathematics and astronomy, were able to organize complex societies and preserve knowledge, across generations. Then what does that say about human potential? What does that say about what we might be able to accomplish if we really put our minds to it? The discoveries being made in the Sahara are just the beginning. They're opening a door to a deeper understanding of our past. A past that's far richer, far more complex, and far more impressive than we ever imagined. And as more discoveries are made, as more evidence comes to light, as more researchers begin to question the conventional narrative, we're going to see a transformation in how we understand human history. We're going to see a recognition that our ancestors were not primitive savages struggling to survive, but sophisticated peoples with advanced knowledge capable of remarkable achievements. So I encourage you to keep an open mind to question what you've been taught, to look at the evidence for yourself, and to join me in this journey of discovery. Because the truth about our past is out there waiting to be found, buried beneath the sands of the Sahara, hidden in the jungles of the Amazon, submerged beneath the oceans, and preserved in the myths and legends that have been passed down through countless generations. And when we finally uncover that truth, when we finally piece together the full story of human civilization, I think we're going to find that it's far more incredible, far more inspiring, and far more empowering than anything we've been told before. But anyways, I'm going to wrap this up here, because this video is getting pretty long. I hope you found this information as fascinating as I did. I hope it's made you think, made you question, made you want to learn more, because that's what this is all about. It's about seeking truth. It's about uncovering the mysteries of our past, and it's about understanding who we really are as a species. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and let me know what you think about all of this. Do you believe there are lost civilizations buried beneath the Sahara? Do you think our history is more complex than we've been taught? What discoveries do you think are waiting to be made? I want to hear from you, because this conversation is just beginning, and there's so much more to explore. So anyways, take care, everyone. Look forward to the next video. And remember, keep questioning, keep searching, and keep an open mind, because the truth is out there waiting to be discovered. Bye, everybody.